Good evening, everybody. I want to thank Jalen for inviting me to present and for organizing this terrific program. It's so wonderful to see you all, and it's just a terrific turnout. So looking forward to having a great conversation with everyone tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to first talk a little bit about 1L Big Law Summer Diversity positions, and then shift into 2L Big Law Summer Diversity positions and OCI. And then some quick tips on resumes, cover letters, diversity statements, and then just a few kind of OCI tips around networking. I know that there's going to be a separate networking workshop that Jalen has organized as a panel. So I'm just going to touch upon that briefly. And then, as I told Jalen earlier, I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for your questions. So let's start with 1L Big Law Diversity Summer Positions. So December 1st is the first day that you can apply for summer Big Law Diversity positions, but it's not a deadline. Historically, most firms do not extend offers until after they see grades, and February is the month with the most offers, sort of anecdotally. A lot of 1Ls decide to focus all of their energy on preparing for final exams. And some of the benefits of this approach are that you leave enough space to do the very best that you can on your final exams. This is important because, as you know, if you're wanting to do a judicial clerkship or big law after graduation, grades can be important in that calculus. And the other thing that I think is true is that after final exams, when you have a chance to kind of finally catch up on sleep, you'll have a lot more mental energy to focus on putting together the very best applications you can for those 1L summer positions. There's truly no advantage to rushing these applications and getting them in before final exams. In fact, doing so could increase the likelihood of errors or typos in your application when you're trying to juggle studying with proofreading and finalizing your application materials. And it could also leave you less time to draft really strong diversity statements. I think an important thing to remember is that submitting a mediocre application will not only decrease your chances of getting a 1L position, but it's important because you'll also probably be applying to many of the same firms for 2L summer. So this first application is your chance to make a strong first impression, and you want to make sure that you give yourself enough time and space to get this right. Now, Jalen told me that probably most of the attendees would be 2Ls, so most of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be a little bit more relevant for 2Ls, but some of the resume and cover letter tips and diversity statement tips will also be relevant for the 1Ls who are either here live or who will be listening to this recording later. So for 2L summers, you might know there aren't as many sort of standalone diversity positions specifically for 2Ls as there are for 1Ls. However, there's no question that firms are still incredibly committed to hiring diverse candidates for their 2L summer programs. So you'll want to make sure, as you prepare your materials, that your resume prominently features your participation in affinity groups, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion community efforts that you have been involved in throughout law school and before. If you are applying for a standalone 2L summer diversity position, you want to make sure that you spend a little bit of time updating your diversity statement from 1L year. If you did diversity work on or off campus, be sure to include and incorporate that into your updated statement. Also, if your practice area focus has sharpened since 1L year, you might now know that you're more interested in litigation or you're more interested in corporate transactional work, make sure to include this in your updated statement as well. I'm going to be providing specific tips on cover letters and diversity statements in just a little bit, but I wanted to just flag two quick items for 2Ls in the audience. If your application calls for a diversity statement and a cover letter, the cover letter that you submit should be very brief and to the point. And if the application that you're submitting for a diversity position does not ask you for a diversity statement, then you want to make sure that you tell your diversity story in your cover letter, since you won't have the opportunity to do it in a standalone diversity statement. Now I'm going to shift to talking a little bit about resumes. So employers tell us that they want to see the same resume format. They're looking at a high volume of resumes, and they need to be able to find what they are looking for quickly and efficiently. Unlike in interviews where you want to stand out, legal resumes should all look pretty similar and follow the same format. Your big law resume should be one page, and it should be readable. 11-point font is probably the minimum font size for readability. Legal resumes also should not have an objective section or a list of references or indicate that references are available. You really want to follow the kind of traditional format with resumes. In terms of your resume header, this is where you include your contact information so that law firms can get in touch with you, most notably your phone number and your email address. For your header, I personally prefer the very top header here. I think that's the best and most professional. I'm also constantly thinking about how we can keep students' resume on one page as they move through law school, which I know gets difficult, especially if you have pre-law school professional experience. You should only use this kind of longer and header with 4 lines if your resume is somewhat sparse. Perhaps if you're a 1L and you came straight through from undergraduate, you could use a header like this, but this is my preferred header. In terms of the education section, it should go first because you are currently enrolled in law school. This section should take up no more than about 1/3 of your resume. And a couple things to note. For affinity groups, you want to, again, make sure and prominently feature your affiliation with the affinity group. And for 2Ls, if you have a leadership position in your affinity group at this point, you also want to prominently feature that in your resume. In terms of activities, if you took the initiative to demonstrate your interest in a particular practice area or to build relevant skills, you'll also want to prominently feature this in your OCI resume as well. Here are some examples. So if you enrolled in your moot court team or in any other kind of advocacy competition, this signals to law firms that you are interested in litigation, right? And that's helpful. That hopefully is also something that you'll have the chance to talk about during your screening interviews. If you are a member of the Business Law Journal or the Sports and Entertainment Law Journal, if you have gotten involved in contract drafting simulations or negotiations, these are all, again, activities that you want to feature on your resume, especially if you want to do corporate or transactional work. And then in terms of coursework, if you are interested in intellectual property, and especially if you don't have a science or technology kind of background, you want to make sure and signal to employers that this is a practice area that you're interested in by demonstrating that through being on your tech journal, your IP journal, or taking IP coursework. These are all ways in which you can use your resume to signal both interest in practice areas and the type of law that you want to practice. So now moving on to the experience section. Some people will try to break out the experience section. For example, they might have a work experience, professional experience, volunteer experience, leadership experience. Again, just in terms of trying to be succinct and efficient with your resume so that employers can find exactly what they want as quickly as is possible, you want to just have an experience section, right? Where you can put all of your professional experience, your community service experience, your leadership experience should all be under that experience section. I strongly prefer a paragraph form, as you can see here, as opposed to bullets. Attorneys are really good at skimming and finding exactly what they need. It's a skill that we all develop, and bullets can make things look really sparse. In terms of how you list your experience, you want it to be in reverse chronological order by end date, so the most recent experience first. If you came to law school straight from undergrad, I think it's okay to kind of use these sort of semester year date formats. But if you're not straight through and you have some pre-law school professional experience, be sure instead to use the month year format. Now, some jobs don't need descriptions, and this will definitely help you to keep your resume on one page. Employers have told us that they definitely like when students have worked during undergrad and or worked in service professions. There's no question that any student who did this developed good skills such as time management and balance when having to try to work and achieve their full potential academically at the same time. I know that my time as a dishwasher and a busboy and a server gave me some interesting stories and anecdotes to share in job interviews about what I saw and what I heard. And I bet the same is true for folks who worked in retail or other service jobs. Finally, remember that anything on your resume is fair game for interviews. You want to be sure to talk about anything and everything on your resume. I think a good exercise to go through before your interviews is to go through your resume and have a prepared anecdote that you are ready to share, a story or a transferable skill that you gained from everything that's on your resume, just so that you're prepared and you're not caught off guard when an interviewer asks you a question and you haven't thought about it in years, right? Let's talk about the interest section for a minute. I think in the big law context, this section is actually quite important. Big law interviewers often will pull from this section during screening interviews because of the volume of screeners that they're doing during OCI. And remember, a big part of making it from the screening interview to the callback stage is making a connection with your interviewer. And sometimes you do that through your interest section. You don't want to have too many. I think 3 to 5 is a good range for the number of interests that you want to list on your resume. This is super important. Remember that every element of your application packet is considered to be another writing sample. And as a junior attorney, attention to detail is so important. And attorneys are really good at finding errors and typos in documents. If a big law associate finds a typo or error in your resume, they may bring it up during your screening interview. And you want to do everything possible now to avoid that happening. Ask a classmate or a friend to do a final proofread of your resume, and then you'll do a final proofread, and taking these additional steps, making sure that there are no errors or typos on your resume will help you feel confident going into your interview that you'll be able to talk about the things on your resume that you're most excited about, what you're interested in terms of the firm and its practice areas and its culture and its training opportunities, instead of trying to explain why you made a mistake on your resume. That's an easy error to avoid with a little bit of extra time. Let's shift now to cover letters. So I want to talk about when you might need a cover letter in the OCI context, because this is actually quite different than other job searches. So if there are firms that are interested, that you're interested in, and they are coming to your OCI, there is typically no need to write a cover letter unless the firm asks for a cover letter. Because of the volume of applications that firms receive, typically they're going to scan your resume and they're not going to have time to read additional cover letters. Now, there are a few exceptions, and I want to walk us through those. They are quite limited in my experience. And so sometimes a firm might ask for a cover letter in its description of the summer program in your OCI portal. And they might do this sometimes in their website recruiting portal if they are a firm that doesn't typically do OCI, right? So sometimes a firm might want a cover letter because they want students to specify a practice area preference or to rank geographical preferences if they are recruiting for multiple offices in different cities. When the firm does request a cover letter, keep it really short and to the point. It's going to be much more like a form letter than it is going to be for the kind of letter that you might have written in the past for a public interest job or a government job. An exception to this might be if you have something major to explain on your resume that you could probably elaborate on more confidently in a cover letter. An example of this might be a big gap in employment on your resume. You can use your cover letter to do this, but I would encourage you to run this strategy by your career counselor and your mentors to make sure that this is the right judgment call for you. What about when there is a firm that you'd like to apply to that's not coming to your OCI? So most big law firms, as you might know, have an interface on their website that will tell you how to apply for summer positions and to whom you should email your materials. If they don't, you should check the NALP directory, that's nalpdirectory.com, for this information. If it's not on the firm's website or on the NALP directory, you can email a recruiting contact to get more information about how and to whom you should apply for summer positions. So what is the purpose of a cover letter? It's, primarily to introduce yourself. It serves as another writing sample, and it really is persuasive writing. This is an advocacy document. You are making the case for why you are a strong candidate for the job, right? You're advocating for the most important client that you will ever advocate for, which is you. And what goes into this document? These are the elements that typically go into this document. This is what employers tend to be looking for in a cover letter. Really drawing that connection between your experiences and the transferable skills that you gained from them and how it would demonstrate your potential to excel at the firm. That's really the case that you want to be making very succinctly in your cover letter if the law firm is specifically requesting it. Some unwritten rules of law school cover letters. One page only. You want to make sure that all of your application documents have the same kind of header, right? That's going to look really professional if you're using the same header for your resume, for your cover letter, for any other application documents that you're asked to submit. Use the same font. It's going to really look professional. And it's really going to pop if you do all of those things. Obviously, no errors, paragraphs, not bullets, customized for each employer, and addressed to the right recruiting contact. Let's move on now to actually working on an actual letter, looking at an actual letter. This is sort of how you'll set up your cover letter document. Your letter should be formatted like business letters typically are in the US. And now that your letter template is set up, let's think through what your substantive content will be. The body paragraphs where you lay out the case for yourself as a candidate. You might want to dive into writing right away, and that's fine, but it can be helpful to do some brainstorming in order to generate ideas from which you can select points to include in your letter. This is especially true when you're customizing letters to an employer's specific practice focus, right? I think outlining in this context is really important. And the good news is that if you are being asked to submit some cover letters for some of the firms that you're applying to, once you put together a really strong foundation for a first cover letter, you'll be able to use that as your template for most of your future cover letters, just spending a few minutes customizing each of those cover letters to make sure that they're specific to each of the firms to which you'll be applying. So what are firms looking for? Some of the skills that we hear about, research, writing, analysis, interpersonal skills, professional skills. And then this last, whatever they say they want, is important. This is just a reminder that before you get too far into the drafting process, to take a step back and to reread the job description. A lot of big law firms can start looking the same, after a while. But in their position descriptions, there might be something nuanced in there that you want to speak to in your cover letter that grabbed your attention, that you want to make sure to convey to show that you understand what the firm is looking for in candidates. So in terms of next steps, you want to make sure that you're evaluating your experiences and drafting more points for your cover letter. Choosing what you really need to include, from your outline in terms of your experiences, what you really want to focus on, what you think is most important. And you're really in the best position to know that, right? In terms of the experiences that have been most transformative for you. And then to put it in an order that sort of is logical and makes sense, and to tie it together with topic sentences and transitions. And then just to make sure that you've got good topic sentences and that you're kind of wrapping everything up in the end. Then lots of proofreading because the same rules apply to the resume that apply to the cover letter. It's going to be perceived as a writing sample, and you want to make sure that it's error-free, no typos, and that you PDF it. I think the same thing is true with your resume, just to make sure that you preserve the formatting so that it looks exactly as you want it to when the recruiter or the employer is viewing it. Okay, I'm going to turn now to diversity statements. So before you start drafting the diversity statement, you want to make sure that you read the prompt carefully. Again, we can sometimes get carried away with outlining. I know this is true for me. If I think about a theme or a story that I'm excited about sharing, and then I'll go back and I've written something really great, and then I'll go back and I'll read the prompt and I will have missed the point. So make sure you first just read the prompt really carefully and think about what story, what theme would respond most directly to that prompt. Think about the target audience, and then identify which experiences and accomplishments you want to highlight. Plan the structure of your statement. Again, treat this as a writing exercise, just as if you were writing a legal memo. Consider how to target your statement. You want to think about approaching this as weaving together a narrative that's connected to different themes that you want to touch upon and that you want to share with the firm. Be specific, but you don't need all of the details. You really want to talk about the experience, what you learned from it, how it shaped you, how it maybe motivated you, how it gave you direction, how it gave you focus, but you don't need to tell all the details in order to make that point. Write like a lawyer, a good lawyer, right? So it's important to get the story and the theme nailed down, but then you really want to shape and massage the language to get it right. Talk about your accomplishments and not just your burdens. Get feedback, right? So once you have your outline, you might even want to pause and talk to a classmate, talk to a mentor, talk to a career counselor to say, these are the themes and stories that I'm thinking about weaving into my diversity statement. Do you think I'm on the right track, right? In terms of the structure itself, you want to make sure that you're piquing the reader's interest with your introduction. Telling a story and weaving into it relevant accomplishments and skills that those experiences gave you that you can bring into your work at the firm. Concluding on a high and positive, ambitious, hopeful note. Now, I want to clear up some common myths and misperceptions about diversity statements. If you had a rough childhood, you do not have to talk about it in your statement. What and how you share about your experiences is up to you. And I think that's true of any trauma that any of us might have experienced in our lives. It's up to us how and when we want to share those stories. You absolutely can talk about race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and how it has shaped your personal and professional identity and journey. You shouldn't just send in your law school diversity statement. Obviously, it was outstanding because it got you into law school. And you can certainly pull themes from it, but be sure to update it and to be responsive to the law firm's prompt. If there's information about you that you would not be comfortable talking about in person, you shouldn't include it in your diversity statement. 2Ls can and should reapply to law firms that rejected them for 1L diversity positions. You are a different candidate now. You will be evaluated differently. And because you applied as a 1L, you have signaled to the firm that you're very interested in them. And by applying again, you're showing that you're persistent and that you know what you want and how to get it. So some diversity statement musts. Tell your story. Tell your authentic story. Be professional in the way in which you present your story. Keep the messaging positive and hopeful. Have at least one person review and give you feedback. Tailor your statement to the job scholarship, to the job or to the scholarship. Go back and review the prompt and follow all the directions. Again, sometimes I fall victim to this as well. I'll get so carried away that I'll have written something that's twice as long as it needs to be. And then you're back in a position where you've got to edit everything. So again, review the prompt, make sure that you're responding to it, and then make sure that you are using the word count feature when you're drafting. And then proofread again, get somebody else to proofread, make sure that it's error-free. You're putting your best foot forward and submitting not just a strong and compelling story, but one that is well written and is 100% error-free. So the last thing that I want to talk about is just a couple of quick networking tips. And this kind of relates to OCI and how you might present yourself in OCI and how you might tap into some of the contacts that you've established since you've been in law school. So let's say that through your affinity group, you met an associate who works at a firm you're planning on applying to through OCI. You had a great conversation with this associate and they encouraged you to stay in touch with them. When you apply to their firm, you want to send that associate an email. In that email, you should ask them how they're doing. This is acknowledging this is obviously a challenging time for all of us. And then update them on how you're doing in law school, what you've been up to, what you've gotten involved in, classes that you've liked. Thank them again for the great conversation that they had with you earlier, and then let them know that you're in the process of preparing for OCI and that you're excited for it and that you'll be applying to their firm. This is what we call a signaling email. You're not asking the associate to directly recommend you to their firm. This might be difficult for them to do since they've not seen your work, they've not worked with you, and they've not supervised you. But by sending this email, you are creating the possibility of the associate deciding to help you in the OCI process. And instead of the associate being in a position where they have to tell you they can't recommend you, instead you are creating a situation where the associate can decide how and when to help you on their terms. How are some of the ways in which they might support your application? They might decide to flag your application with their recruiting team. This will probably lead to you getting an interview. They may decide to offer to put you in touch with friends they have at other law firms where you might be applying. And this doesn't mean that they aren't going to be able to help you at their firm. It might just mean that, by following up in a professional and respectful way, that you've put yourself in a position where the associate wants to invest in you and to support you and encourage you. So there's lots of ways in which the associate can help you, and you've created this possibility by signaling to them that you are interested in their firm and in big law, just by sending that email. So I will turn it over now to Jalen for questions.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you everyone for your questions. So we have quite a few. Feel free to continue to send questions to me and I will try to get them. I'll try to get them. So the first one we have relates to resumes. So a student asks if you have a particular legal interest, but are concerned that that interest might be very niche and might limit you as it relates to, applying for an available position. What do you suggest in that instance?
So if they have that very specific interest, yeah, I mean, so I think it is fine to convey, especially if there is a cover letter or a diversity statement in which you can convey that specific interest that might be quite sort of, tailored and focused. If there's not an opportunity to do that, I think it's something that you can talk about in your interview. But if it's a big law firm and they are what we call full service firm, meaning they do just about anything, I think it's okay for you to talk about your specific interest, but you also want to make sure that you talk about the fact that as a young associate, you're interested in getting exposed to a wide variety of different practice areas and experiences at the firm, that you have developed this very specific interest. And it's part of the reason why you are interested in the firm, but to be ready to talk about some of the more general opportunities at the firm, just in case it might be a practice area where, first year associates don't necessarily have the opportunity to work in that practice area. They have to gain some experience first. I know this is true in like the sports and entertainment law context. It's pretty difficult to do that right out of law school, but it's definitely something that somebody could do, a little bit further into their career if they were at a firm that had that practice group. But perhaps in the beginning, they're doing kind of general transactional work. That's kind of the way I would handle it.
Got it. Thank you. The next one is, are there any differences between the suggestions you would make for 1Ls, 2Ls, and 3Ls? So you kind of highlighted 1Ls and 2Ls here, but a 3L is interested in how their resume might be tweaked or looked a little different from a 1L or 2L.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think for 3Ls, it's really important to spend lots of time meaningfully drafting the descriptions for your first summer and your second summer, because you really want to be able to seize upon the experience that you gained during those summers to make the case about why a firm, should hire you at the entry level for an entry level associate position. I think also specifically, you want to be able to really play up, since you've probably had the chance to get pretty engaged in one or more activities, or including journals and competitions. You really want to be able to play those up as well, just because you cumulatively, you want to really show that you've been very intentional about building experience, that meaningful experience, that will allow you to sort of hit the ground running as an entry-level associate.
The next one comes from an 1L. So obviously with COVID, it's been a bit hard for 1Ls to engage and be active on campus as it relates to different organizations or different groups. So what do you suggest for them into making their resume stand out, or just being able to stand out in general?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I know that things are getting a little bit closer to finals at this point, and there's a little bit less time to engage in some of the networking efforts. So, my recommendation just in terms of what to focus on as a 1L, in the months ahead is your application materials. I think as well, if you feel like you've got the bandwidth after finals to maybe have a couple of conversations, or before, depending upon your own personal capacity. But if you have the bandwidth to have a couple of conversations with either 2Ls or 3Ls who successfully were able to get 1L diversity positions, to get a sense of why they feel like they were successful in that process, and what kind of advice they might have for you about how to tailor your materials. And again, that is another signaling email, because if the conversation goes well, that 2L or 3L could want to be more meaningfully engaged in supporting you, maybe with their firm. So it's kind of a win-win, I think. And then if you've got the personal capacity to do this, maybe having one conversation with a young associate at a law firm, maybe doing a quick informational interview with a young associate at a law firm that you might be able to get connected to, through your affinity group or through your journal or through your career services office. I think those are kind of the three things that I would recommend focusing on as a 1L.
For students with a host of work experience, one student asks how far should they go back and post and how much information should they put on their resume? How do they know what to leave out, what to include if they have a long list of experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this kind of goes back to one of the slides that I shared earlier, which was conveying that there are some positions for which you will not need descriptions, right? And then beyond that, if there are additional positions that you want to list on your resume to show consistent work history, to show interesting work history, to show the kind of work history that would lead a law firm to believe that you are, and to see that you are a person of character and integrity with a strong work ethic, all of which is, I think, very positive and compelling. There's a section that I would call additional information on your resume. This might be where your interests live as well, language skills, that kind of thing. That could be another place where you could potentially list additional experience. I probably wouldn't go back any farther than before college in terms of work experience, just to sort of give you a sense of timing. But there are ways to include in your resume, I think, and to signal to employers that you have a long work history. It's just going to require you to do a little bit of formatting magic and kind of use kind of truncated language in order to try to keep that resume on one page if you can.
Got it. The next one is coming from a 3L, and they're currently enrolled in a community development clinic. So it's a mix of a seminar and then actual practical experience. So they want to know, can they add the clinic work to their resume or cover letter? And if so, what section should it go in?
Yes, absolutely. I think even if a clinic might be a more traditional public interest sort of endeavor, I think certainly a community development clinic has lots of transferable skills that law firms are going to look favorably upon. So I think if you have space and you feel like it was a really meaningful experience that you want to actually be asked about in your interview because you're passionate about it and you're clear that it gave you lots of transferable skills that you'll be able to use in practice as an attorney at the law firm, it probably should go under your experience section, if you've got the space for it. If you don't, then you could probably put it under your activities section. But again, if you believe it was a meaningful experience that you want to be asked about, I would recommend putting it in your experience section.
What type of information should be included in the interest section?
Right. So sometimes, I think these fall into different categories, right? Sometimes people are into music, sometimes people are into art, so sometimes it kind of falls into a creative bucket, I would say. Sometimes it falls into a category of like, what do you like doing when you're not studying and reading about the law? So it might fall into like a fitness category. That'd be another one that I think I would see sometimes. And then I think there's a sports category, which is, I have found in my life, a good way to connect with people in different geographical areas of the country. There might also be a community service category as well, if you're involved in mentoring or you're just involved in volunteering in general. So that's kind of the way to think about it, is like, what do you feel passionate about doing kind of outside of the law? And again, think about it through the lens of the employer and think about it as like, what would you want to be asked about? What would kind of make you light up, if you were asked about it in an interview?
The next question is, if your resume reflects a public service or criminal law background, both academically and professionally, but you're looking to go into big law, how can you convey to some of these firms that you're ready to pivot to the private sector and be able to highlight some of the skills that you believe are transferable?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to move into general litigation, I think a criminal law background is pretty transferable. I mean, what sometimes I'll advise my students to frame around this when they're preparing for interviews or putting together their application materials to try to make the case to a law firm that they want to do general lit, but they've been doing crim most of their time in law school, is to say that, they remain passionate about criminal justice, and they remain passionate about litigation and wanting to be a trial lawyer, but they've decided that they, want to do general litigation instead of criminal law, that they've actually realized that their true passion is in the litigation process and not necessarily, being a trial lawyer in the criminal justice arena. That can sometimes be a good case to be made because, if you worked in a public defender office or a district attorney office or for the U.S. Attorney's Office, federal defender's office, like you developed really good litigation and trial lawyering skills, and general lit practices are interested in that background.
For those students who have a basic knowledge of a language, how do they notate that on the resume, and where should that go? Should it go under skills? Should it go under interest? What you're thinking on that?
Yeah, so I would put that under the additional information section. So it'd be in the same section as where your interests live. And again, think about, if you're in an interview and you list your proficiency as fluent or somewhat close to fluent, and the interviewer happens to also speak that language, they might just launch into the language during the interview. So just be careful about your level of proficiency. I would say err on the side of making it a little bit, if you're not fluent, maybe making it a little bit less than you might actually think it is, just to be on the safe side.
Got it. A few students have asked, will they be able to receive a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Sure.
Thank you. We appreciate it. The next one is, if someone has quite a bit of relevant legal work experience, do you have any tips on how they can cut the resume down to one page? So a student is struggling with condensing their resume because they have a extensive amount of legal work experience.
Absolutely. It's challenging. It's definitely challenging for people who have a little bit more experience. But it's a good exercise to go through because sometimes we can get really attached to older versions of our resume and we're really reluctant to let go of some of the content that used to be on it. So I always encourage people to keep what I call kind of the kitchen sink resume, which is like you throw everything in it, right? You always want to have that because you never know when you're going to need that version. And that version might be 3 or 4 pages and you might always pull content from it. But it is a good exercise to go through to really try to be more succinct in your descriptions of particular experiences, and to really try to get down to 1 or 2 phrases for each description that you feel are the most meaningful aspects of that experience that you definitely want to be asked about in an interview. Remember that your resume is really just an introduction to you. It doesn't have to be comprehensive. It should not be comprehensive, right? It should just kind of be an introduction to you, and it should lead attorneys who are interviewing you to ask follow-up questions. It does not need to be comprehensive.
Got it. The next question is, so there's a few students who are on the Zoom who are interested in in-house and government positions. So they were wondering how much different what their resume, cover letter, or diversity statements look. While most of this has been geared about, getting law firm opportunities, can you just talk about whether they would still apply many of the same, strategies and practices that you talked about tonight?
Absolutely. For government, I think it's quite different because most government positions do require a cover letter. And that cover letter really needs to speak to your interest in the mission of the agency and your demonstrated commitment to public service. That's really important. Those are the two top items that every government lawyer that I've ever worked with has told me they look for right up front in a cover letter. If those two elements are not there, you might not make it to the next stage. So really studying the mission of the agency and being ready to speak specifically whether you have a personal connection to the mission of the agency or you have an academic interest in the mission of the agency, and then aspects of your background that sort of speak to why you want to serve the public as a government attorney. Super, super important. I think for in-house, much more like the big law application process, except that it's possible that some of the in-house positions might ask for a short cover letter, in which case it's really important for you to talk specifically about what the, what the company does, why it sort of speaks to you, even though as an in-house lawyer, you might be doing some labor and employment, you might be doing some IP, and you might be doing some contract negotiation. You do a little bit of everything, right, as an in-house lawyer. So, but it's important, I think, companies will want to hear, why Netflix, why Apple, why Google, so there's a little bit more customization, a little bit more content than you might find in a 2L kind of big law cover letter.
For the 1Ls who are applying to diversity positions that require diversity statement, but there's no specific prompt, what do you suggest they do? Should they tell a recent story, use an older story? Is there really any guidance you can provide on that, or is it just more of a feel thing, kind of whatever they think conveys the best message about them and their path to law school and what they want to do post law school?
Yeah, Jalen, I think what you just kind of described in the latter part of the way you were framing the question, I think when there is not a prompt, the best thing to do is to try to connect to a theme or a story that might have led you to law school, and then I know that this is only 1L fall for semester, but if there are, obviously a lot has happened this year in our country and in our world, and so if there are further events that have sort of confirmed that this was the right choice, and why. So kind of making those connections, what brought you to law school, now that you're in law school, what kind of catalyzing events have confirmed for you that this is the right career path, and then making the connection to a little bit more to, why big law practice, and why this particular firm, more of the cover letter piece. But those kind of three segments, I think I would use when there's no prompt.
Got it. Let's see. What are your thoughts on using resumes that include photos of the students or any kind of elaborate designs?
I would probably recommend not using photos or elaborate design. Again, I think employers just over the years, I've been doing this for a long time, and I feel like employers over the years just tell us that they want to see the same format, and that what they really want in terms of being able to get a sense of what makes someone unique, they want that to come through in the interview, not in the resume.
So we have two more. The second to last one is, if you've applied to a program or internship before, and this is your second time applying, should you mention in your cover letter that you've applied before, or is that something you should hold off and perhaps talk about if you were to get an interview discuss, being able to speak to how you've always wanted to be at this in-house government or law firm?
That's a great question. I personally would recommend referencing that this is the second time you're applying, because I think it shows that you're determined, you're resilient, you're not giving up. And what remains true, as you move into your second year or your third year, is that you still want this, and you want it more now than ever because you're a more well-informed law student and your focus is sharper and clearer at this point.
Got it. So one student has an interest in cannabis law and or has worked in the related field before. So they want to know, how can they put it in their resume or cover letter without the risk of a stigma or any kind of disqualification?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fast growing area of the law. And it's become so mainstreamed, especially out here on the West Coast. I think there, just tremendous growth opportunities in terms of employment. I think it depends a little bit. My general sense is that if the employment itself is something, again, that the student would want to be asked about in an interview, both because it would signal that this is an area of the law that they want to move into. And I think all law firms are looking at trying to pick up clients in this space as more and more states legalize. So I see it probably as an asset. Again, just being prepared that if you do put it on your resume, that you need to be ready to talk about what it taught you, what you learned from it, the skills that it helped you develop. And maybe from the business perspective, just kind of how you witnessed as an employee, how the business, sort of developed while you were there.
Got it. And our last question is, what advice can you give to students who have not decided where they want to be geographically ahead of applying for summer positions, with the consideration that firms are often looking to invest in students who, want to stay in that particular area post-grad? So what advice do you have for those students?
Yeah, if you're not, I think particularly if you're a 1L, but even if you're a 2L, but maybe even more so if you're a 1L, the big law positions obviously are competitive, right? And they're competitive because it's a numbers game. They're not competitive because you're not a compelling candidate. Everyone on this call is a compelling candidate. It's more because law firms might only be hiring 1 or 2 1Ls, for their summer classes, because their summer classes are primarily 2Ls, right? So there is a case to be made as a 1L to go anywhere if it's possible, if you're truly geographically flexible and you have the ability to go and work in another market, because it will provide you with both the chance to work in big law, but also the chance to make some money and get great experience. I've had lots of students that have done like the DAP program and, have gone to Texas, even though they'd never lived there before, but because there were opportunities there. I think it's a little bit harder as a 2L, just because that's when you want to try to get that return offer, for after graduation. So it's a little bit more challenging with geography, but I think I'll also put in a plug for DC, which is where I lived and practiced for a long time. It's a great legal market to be in. And the nice thing about it is that if you go and you work at a law firm there and you want to take the New York bar, the California bar, the Maryland bar, the Georgia bar, you can waive into DC and then, try it out. And if it's not for you, you can go back to the market where you took your bar in and work for another firm. So that's definitely a big advantage for someone who might not know where they want to be, but who wants to keep options open for the future.
Well, I hope everyone can join me in thanking Eric for taking the time to do this with us. He will also be with us in the spring semester after we all have secure jobs. He will give us some best practices for how to make that a valuable summer, and how to navigate in the summer. All of us will have a sense whether we'll be in person or if it's a hybrid system. He'll give us a great sense of that. I also just want to raise your attention. We have a few more events coming up. I know it's getting busy for everyone, but we're going to have a panel on best practices for interviewing. That's next Thursday. We will have a few attorneys from different law firms. We will skip Thanksgiving. The following Thursday, we have a program regarding best practices for interviews. And then all of you will get to enjoy your winter break and then do well in your interview. So thanks again, Eric, for taking the time. Thank you all for joining and spending your Thursday evening with us. And I look forward to seeing you all in the future.
Thanks, Jalen. Take care, everyone. Be safe. Good luck on finals.